good afternoon, depending where you are. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. This is something new we are trying at Caucasus Edition. If you had joined us before for our webinars, you are probably familiar with our analytic New War and Peace series that have been running since essentially the end of the Second Karabakh War in late 2020. Now we are trying something new. We are starting a new educational series that we titled The State of Peace and Conflict Studies Today. And what we mean by that is that what's the difference between this format and the previous one, rather the content. And the previous one is that the War and Peace series are more analytic and focused more on the political developments of the day. And we intend to continue with these ones. And the educational one is taking a bit of a shift. And the primary focus is somewhat of a conceptual theoretical discussion about what is what is conflict resolution, what is peace building, why are they so bad essentially in helping us solve our conflicts or get closer to peace, and maybe how can we improve and what we can learn. So the focus will be again somewhat more conceptual and theoretical, of course, with clear links to the South Caucasus and Karabakh and our own conflicts. So with that in mind, this is the very first meeting of this series. And we are specifically focusing on that general question, what is the state of peace and conflict studies, and what, if anything, they can offer to the South Caucasus. The next one will follow up in only a week from now, next Thursday. This one starts at 8 p.m. Caucasus. The next one will start an hour earlier. We'll start at 7 p.m. Caucasus, and we will post the link here. And that will focus on somewhat of a more specific topic of what is violence and how to work with that. And the presenters then will be Lala Darchinova from Azerbaijan and Kristina Soloyan from Armenia. Both are editors of Caucasus Edition. And very briefly about the format of this meeting. So that in that sense, we are similar to what we've done in the past. We will have speakers and we'll talk about 30, 35, maybe maximum 40 minutes. And then we will leave about 20 minutes for Q&A or a discussion. Because we have a pretty large audience, we're not letting everybody to the screen, so it will be, too many people. But as the time comes, if you would like to post questions or make comments, you can use the Q&A button in the bottom for the questions, or if it's just a comment, use the chat button. And please leave your comments there. So I'll stop there and turn to my good colleague Sevinj Samadzadeh, with whom actually we met about more than 10 years ago now, not surprisingly, in a peace building or peace focused forum. The times are very different, and that's very relevant to what we are discussing here. The times are very different. At the time, Switzerland was taking the presidency of OSCE, and they had, it was 2013, I believe, and 2014, they were intending to solve the conflict by taking the chairmanship of OSCE. They had this big commitment that in 2014, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict will be solved. They appointed a big task force by their foreign ministry, and they invited Sevinj, myself, and a number of other Armenian, Azerbaijani, and international experts to talk about how OSCE essentially can solve this conflict. Today, it would be very hard to imagine even something like that OSCE can dare to take a task of solving a conflict, right? And how much really in 10 years the world has changed. And that is, one of the topics essentially that we intend to cover. But let me turn to Sevinj. Sevinj, if you don't mind, maybe introduce yourself a bit, and if possible, let's start a bit personal about why, what brings you to peace building and what keeps you in it despite all the failures you are facing.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. Thank you for this introduction and for reminding how we met, actually. Basically, if I start how I got engaged in peacebuilding, it dates back to more than 10 years ago. But I'd like to start by saying that, first of all, I am a feminist researcher, an activist, and I am currently doing my PhD at Ghent University. on the topic of relationship between geopolitics and the social services that are being provided for women. I have previously studied security studies of Middle East, Caucasus, and Central Asia, and also in my undergrad, also I studied international relations, had a large focus on peace and conflict. But precisely the way I was engaged in peace studies, in addition to the research that I was doing, was also the projects, the peace building, so-called peace building projects that I was involved in. I would say precisely between 2017 and 2019, I was more intensively involved in various formats of peace projects. And that's where I already began questioning a lot of strategies and tactics that was being pursued by default. And then it became somehow somewhat a truce in 2020 when the war started in Karabakh. Out of projects that was already on the ground, ones that I organized or co-organized, and all the participants who were part of it changed their perspective and turned into nationalism. And it led me personally to question further the discipline itself and all the tactics and all the buzzwords and strategies that it has been providing us for years. Basically, the 2020 war triggered to find different forms of answers in search for peace and understanding precisely where things went wrong. And theoretically speaking, that's where I think the failures of liberal peace provided itself more visibly, which today we will probably talk largely more. There's also a little bit of a personal part of the story, which is that I come from a border region in Azerbaijan, which has also shaped, kind of motivated me also to continue in this, to work in this field. But now today, I would position myself not directly just working in the peace studies or doing something for the peace studies, but more somewhere in the interdisciplinary section of several disciplines. And I think that's where it's it has more possibilities to think more critically and through cross-discipline understanding of many different thematics, including peace, conflict, violence, and so on. Yeah, I think that's what still motivates me to still be in the field. And I think it's time to reconceptualize peace, violence, and to redefine it beyond the already existing doctrines, which is more liberal or post-liberal doctrines, and search path towards what is truly transformative liberative liberation, or what is more just, basically. How did you come to this peace studies, and what still motivates you?
Thanks. Thank you, Sevinj, for your starting us off. And my personal background, I grew up during the first Karabakh War and was a pretty nationalist teenager. I supported the war pretty actively at the time. And one of the reasons was that, being on one side, I've been hearing a lot about what Azerbaijani side have been doing to Armenians, and had a strong, huge motivation to do something about it. But also overall, right? So I saw war in a very kind of romanticized way, the way I read in books, the way I saw in movies. Then time went by, and I saw the devastation that the war brought to Armenia. But probably even more importantly, throughout these years, I also started learning and seeing what the Armenian side has done to the Azerbaijanis, and realized it was never one-sided. And once you go to violence, it's actually extremely, your side also has responsibility, specifically learning about the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijanis. And a lot of them I've seen in my own neighborhoods in Yerevan, who then disappeared, and I've seen the harassment towards them. And then, of course, from Karabakh and surrounding regions, and all the destruction. So that really changed my perception of the war, but also put a question mark on my own responsibility in a way. It's as much as small as it was, as a young person, still supporting it. So that led me down the road to consider going to studying conflict resolution, peace building, and doing something about it. Since I supported the war, I felt a responsibility to now contribute to peace. And I came to the US to study peace building. And in that sense, I'm very classically trained in a way. So I came in mid 2000s, which is when there was the height maybe of the culmination of liberal peacebuilding, where really you were trying to solve conflicts through democratization, through in the expansion of the know-how of European experience of solving conflict. There was very clear blueprints we were learning from Northern Ireland, from French, German experience. So I learned all of that and really then engaged in, then I reached out to Azerbaijani students who were similar to me studying in the US at the time. And as we started meeting, organized dialogues for ourselves, and then established an organization called Imagine Center for Conflict Transformation, which has been long co-led by Armenians Azerbaijanis. And the Caucasus edition is part of Imagine Center's activities, as you probably all know. So essentially, it's been that my personal motivation, very classical introduction to conflict studies, then dialogues with Azerbaijani colleagues and friends, and then starting joint work. We worked for many years now, 15, 16 years. Within that paradigm, in a way, trying to promote peace through democratization, through dialogue. And then, of course, similar to what you were saying, Sevinj, started questioning this. And then as we hit the Second Karabakh War, it became obvious that everything we've done did not lead to any solution. And worst of all, we didn't even have any kind of peace movement standing up to the war. Not only there was a war, but also essentially all these 30 years of liberal peace building and peace building in general brought to really nothing in the sense of maybe 5-10 people in each side actually stood up against the war and suffered pretty seriously for their stance. While all these generations of peace builders and hundreds and thousands of people who participated in trainings mostly turned to war, or in the best case, stay silent. So that really put a lot of questioning for myself into what do I know, how do we work? We considered completely quitting. After the war, we had a meeting with the colleagues, and the question was, do we even worth anything? Do we even have anything to contribute, or should we, just close the workshop and go home and do something else? But then we decided to stay specifically with the purpose of rethinking and changing and completely acknowledging that everything to that point was a total failure. So for me, it is. If you have a war, then the peace building has failed. And as a peace builder, I feel you need to acknowledge this. But I think now I also can see where it went wrong, how many mistakes there were, and how it's possible in principle to rethink. So that's the conversation we are hoping to start here. Yeah, so thank you for also asking the personal question to me.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. Yeah, in fact, I see a lot of similarities in our experience, both as living and growing up in the conflict-affected communities or societies, but also later going through all these dynamics of learning and trying to unlearn certain things that were taught to us by default. But it's also interesting when talking about learning and unlearning. Since it's introductory, this session is one of the first ones. I think it will be interesting if you could share briefly the history of peace studies and how do you think it has manifested itself in the South Caucasus region, where it is now, and what are the key achievements and problems of the past 2 decades that failed peace process, basically.
Sure. I'll give a bit of a historical run-up here to the way peace studies developed and how they were applied in South Caucasus, and then would be great to hear your take on this as well. Again, as an academic in a way teaching on these topics, there are different ways of categorizing peace and conflict studies, but I'll take the chronological one for now. And chronologically, it's a relatively new field. It's originated in 60s, 70s of the previous century, essentially following World War II and during the Cold War. And what some of my colleagues called epic or epoch, depending on which English you use. Epic one of peace studies. It again happened during the Cold War, where pretty much it was bipolar world, as we all know, and every violent conflict in some form was also a proxy war. Yeah, in some form, it was also had a strong involvement of one or the other camp. A lot of the conflicts were along ideological lines of communism and capitalism. Not surprisingly, so nuclear non-proliferation, nuclear deterrence emerged. So international relations very much dominated the conversation in these years, again, understandably, because every conflict in some form had this heavy geopolitical context against which it was being fought. So the international relations, specifically the realist school of international relations, which focuses on managing conflict rather than solving, was prevalent because, again, the times didn't necessarily lead towards any hope for a solution. It was more deterrence, hoping to stop, some kind of calculations of power dynamics. So which made perfect sense, and that precedes, in a way, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. As Nagorno-Karabakh conflict emerges, it emerges already, of course, towards the final days of the Soviet Union. And then you have this period where the liberalism wins, right? So Soviet Union collapses, communist camp in a way loses, liberal democracy wins. The end of history is famously or unfamously pronounced by Fukuyama. The end of history assumes this Kantian liberal perpetual peace. Essentially, once everybody is democracy, right? So then we will all have permanent peace. And for a while, it looks actually, living through these years, we all believed that it looked reasonable, as in once, someday we are all democracies and democracies don't fight each other. Concepts started catching up. And we had the period where kind of realist conflict management shifts to liberal peace building. And that becomes fully acceptable and accepted axiomatically almost approach to peace building. And we called it simply peace building. Like only now we are calling it liberal peace building. At the time, it was only called peace building. And it has even date of emergence. In 1992, Boutros Ghali, the head of the UN, pronounces the word peace building and the era of peace building and specific approaches to peace building. So we have this long period where peace through democratization, peace through dialogue, peace through building civil society, kind of very idealistic version of peace is dominant. And again, myself and many of, I believe you as well, essentially were brought up in these times where this was really the model. So we're all supporting in a way a blueprint that Europeans achieved, and now we are going to replicate. So that goes on for good 20 years in a way. As I mentioned earlier, when we met in when Swiss were trying to come in, that was the model, right? So because Europe got it, and now they were going to somehow help us also achieve in South Caucasus. That, of course, starts failing. And I will leave the conceptual part maybe for later, for another day. But very pragmatically, the region didn't democratize. So now whether if it democratized, we could achieve peace or not, I'll leave aside because it's a hypothetical question. But the region didn't democratize. Initially, it started going in that direction. And then the further we went, the further away from democracy we went. And there is such a clear tie between liberalism and peace building in that format that essentially that approach to peace building today doesn't make sense for me in the South Caucasus specifically. Perhaps it makes sense, for example, in Northern Ireland, where both Ireland and UK are democratic spaces. So there maybe, yeah. So you can actually the context is there to continue building in this direction, but in a very democratic space and non-liberal democratic spaces, there is a big mismatch between the approaches that are in democracy with building and our need to not to have violence. So that's the second generation in a way. So yeah, second epoch of 90s, 2000s. What we have now is critique essentially. So there is no third generation in a way of peace building emerging. There's a lot of criticism of the previous two models, which I heavily, mostly agree with. But the third one isn't necessarily a thing. So there are a lot of bits and pieces of that. But the big part of the game, third generation, called critical turn, is actually criticism of realism, which is not necessarily peace building as such. It's a way to maybe minimize violence or maybe fight wars better, but it's not a peace building as such. And the second generation, which is great sounding, but it's very heavily focused on exporting European experience to other parts of the world, which we see doesn't work. So that's the chronology. I'll leave where we are and what possibilities I see right now for later conversation. Would want to see your take on where peace building is.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. This is actually quite comprehensive introduction, I would say, to the history of the studies. So I just want to note that I study security studies, for instance. This is like a kind of the third generation you're mentioning, because now the discipline within the IR has evolved in a sense that there's a peace studies, there's war studies, and then there's a security studies, researching different issues from different angles. But generally, I would say the current state of peace studies or the researchers who are in field is also very historical, so historically shaped. So even though now you're mentioning this critical side of the studies, which is emerging and maybe expanding to some extent, but also generally, I think this criticism of state-centrism still exists within the field, as it is part of the international relations. It is part of a kind of like sub-discipline of the international relations, or connected to the international relations discipline. So a lot of conventional IR understanding of peace building and conflict are still, I would say, very much obvious when we're talking about peace and conflict. And that is where probably the whole contradiction lies, because the IR understanding of peace and conflict is actually reproducing the threats to everyday peace that we are talking about, when the state power is not under challenge. So we are not essentially challenging the states, but we are more addressing how to make the violence between states stop or prevent this. And I think in this way, we are also kind of maybe overlooking to the economy of the conflicts, which is probably now where the discipline tries to navigate and focus more. So that's where the criticism of liberal peace paradigm also comes, because the liberal peace paradigm not only just says through democratization the peace comes, but also emphasize that there is an economic interdependence. If there will be economic interdependence between the nation states, and it will prevent the international violence. And if they will be trade, if they will trade, they will not kill each other, basically. But what this inherently brought after the 90s was all these liberal hegemonic ideas, brought the globalization, right? So through the neoliberal globalization, the new format of globalization of economy happened. And through this understanding of peace as pacification, maybe peace as opening the market, peace as building new trade routes, doesn't necessarily means peace for population. And I think that's where this whole redefinition of peace comes, because there was criticism of peace already in the 60s and 70s when the discipline was emerging as well, because a lot of people were movements were claiming that peace doesn't necessarily mean justice, or peace of ruling class may mean the violence of the oppressed class. So what does peace actually mean? And in that sense, I think we see the interdependency between the global north and global south, or global east and west, however we want to refine it. How through these interdependencies, the colonization, exploitation, expropriation of resources of the global south happened under the name of liberal peace, basically. And therefore, I think we are now more looking through how this concealing imperialist agendas, or how this general disciplining of countries is happening throughout these interdependent relations. And also this kind of helps us to understand the broader sense of politics as well that is going on globally. For instance, the expansion of the market economy in the post-Soviet countries, also the introduction of neoliberal economy and so on, showed itself completely differently, because a lot of times what we saw was neoliberal illiberalism in these countries, and that's precisely because all the social injustices that were not addressed basically ended up in the rise of reactionary movements such as nationalism, populism, and so on. And as you mentioned, the dream of the 90s, where there was a hope that post-Soviet countries would have democratization in this narrow sense of liberal democracy would happen, which it didn't happen, and that's where precisely one of the reasons lie. And it's not only the trend, I would say, in post-Soviet countries, it's now becoming a global trend because of the inevitable contradictions within the capitalism, how now we see consequently more neoliberal illiberalism getting more and more legitimate and popular. We also might see it as a traditional center-left's failure in many contexts to formulate responses to this social dislocations or social injustices that rise out of the crisis situation. So what is now, basically, I think now how I see discipline and how I would envision it as a researcher, as a scholar, I think it has a potential to bring different disciplines, and that's what I already mentioned in the beginning. I think peace study is still very crucial. Of course, we could go beyond this understanding of reforming peace studies, but we could even go further and suggest completely abolishing peace studies. But I think we still need these studies because we need to understand a lot of the different relationships, and it has a lot of potential to bring in different approaches and different epistemologies, essentially, for instance, feminist epistemology, which would challenge the very idea of violence. We could also include the colonial epistemologies and so on. So I think going beyond the initially mentioned the state-centric understanding of peace and conflict would essentially change or transform the discipline. I wouldn't call it reform it. And also this goes through acknowledging of certain social injustices that emerge. So what is the root cause of these social injustices? And how it is connected basically with the neoliberal globalization process. It also applies to our conflict as well. I mean, 2020 war obviously was expected to some extent because there was instances of violence from time to time, and we see how it's escalated. But to some other extent, we see how the wars basically emerge, and how in what time and in what space they emerge. And this analysis also would help us to understand, not to predict necessarily, but at least to understand from a historical point of view how certain things cause certain consequences, basically. And also, one of the things that I think peace studies have overlooked is the relationship between domestic and international. And this is probably also something that is related with what I already mentioned before. And finally, I think there is a broader analytical framework within peace studies that considers historical and political economic context rather than just selectively focusing on some statistical data. For instance, the idea that democratization brings peace was based on certain scholars who brought some statistical ideas that through democratization and through trading and interdependency, some countries, they collaborated, which in reality is not how it went. So I think we need to understand the dialectical relationship between all these neoliberal projects and their movements that emerge. Either they are radical or reactionary, which today they are more reactionary than radical. And finally, the final element I would like to mention is critical examination of military intervention and wars in general under the name of peace, which emerged through, in the history, they emerged through imperialist interventions. Again, precisely after the Second World War, when the peace studies emerged to bring peace and development, the idea of peace and development was very much a Western-centric idea to expand their interventions in the global South and global East. So usually it ended up expanding markets and investments rather than actually fostering genuine peace or stability. So I think I could talk more about it and suggest more maybe new strategies. But I think one thing that we see now is also, and it's not only prevalent for peace studies, it's generally much prevalent for all the other political and social sciences as well. We see the hijacking of agendas. We see hijacking of agendas of, for instance, what peace means. We see from the narratives and discourses of certain political leaders how they repeat the same critical narratives that we would produce or reproduce. So they hijack these agendas, including feminist, the colonial, and so on. So how we will address this hijacking or cooptation of certain agendas, and how we will be able to address all these issues so that we would find certain solutions or answers to our questions. So I will stop here, and I would like to hear your perspective on this, how you think still peace studies can help us to move forward or basically to find answers to some of our questions.
Thank you for this very comprehensive and critical take. As the time is going by, I also want to turn to the questions that are coming from the audience, and then continue based on this. So we already have a question. So if others have, please come in and start typing them. We'll try to address as many as we can, and yeah, we'll try to end at the top of the hour. So will be at 9 o'clock in South Caucasus. So we have another about 28 minutes to this conversation. So there is a question that came up, which is from Margarita Tatarvasian from George Mason University. What is the current state of peace building in South Caucasus? Yeah, so where are we there? Why, despite knowing so much and so much experience, we keep failing? And essentially acknowledging that most of this, what we've done, has been very Western influenced. And the question was also continuous, can we learn something from South Caucasus that can then influence peace studies in general? So that very much ties into where I wanted to go next anyways. So thank you so much, Margarita, and thank you, Sevinj. So where does peace studies are in Caucasus and our role in general, I would say. I mentioned already that during that bipolar world, realism dominated, yeah, in 70s, 80s, and then as we moved to 90s and 2000s, and unipolar world, very kind of liberal democracies dominated time. There was the liberal peace paradigm, which was very, again, pretty clean paradigm. I would say very comprehensive paradigm, which made a lot of sense at the time. I'm not going to go right now into the critique of that. I think we can have a different conversation, maybe specifically devoted to different conceptions of peace. I'll go then. I'll leave it at saying, in democracy, I can see the logic of that, right? So it's somewhat more indigenous to places such as Europe, where that paradigm emerged. I'm questioning its relevance for now, the parts of the world where there is no liberal democratization happening. And in general, the conflicts have shifted. So if we had this bipolar world and ideological conflicts of Cold War, and then we had unipolar world, and we had all the conflicts shifting away from international wars for a period of time, what we call the new wars, were mostly internal conflicts, right? So there were identity conflicts, were framed in identity terms. So then all the focus shifted to this, with an assumption that international warfare is a thing of the past, and now we're going to have no international warfare anymore, and we're going to have only local conflicts that we can solve. But there were some clear contexts against which these were developing. The third period, I think, not only chronologically we didn't get there yet to develop a new paradigm, I think it will be extremely difficult to develop a paradigm now similar to liberal peace, all-encompassing one, because the world is very fragmented. Yeah, it's neither bipolar nor unipolar. It's multipolar in terms of international relations, but also power is shifting. So it's not only anymore located in the states the way it probably was a couple of centuries ago. So it's clearly much more dispersed. So the conflicts are reflecting that as well. We now have international conflicts, obviously, you can see in Russia, Ukraine, and not only, right, of course, there are a lot of proxy wars, just looking at Syria and Gaza and many others, right? So essentially, there are not anymore internal conflicts. The whole world is fighting each other. You also have a lot of identity-based, still framed conflicts in a lot of localities. You have non-state groups, right? ICE being an obvious example, actually, right? So making claims to new type of, in a way, organization. So you have multiple, you have a lot of internal violence that is, say, gender-based. So you have multiple conflicts simultaneously taking place. And in that sense, they're very different in terms of how they originate, what is their infrastructure that supports them. So in that sense, it's very hard to put one all-encompassing solution similar to liberal peace on the board. So that's the problems. What's happening in South Caucasus? So it's interesting space because, for example, in Colombia, I was talking to some colleagues working there. There were always indigenous, for a long time, peace processes in place. That were, yes, they had all the liberal intervention coming in with transitional justice and all, but they also had a lot of indigenous processes that somehow make peace possible in different localities. So I think in South Caucasus is different in that sense because it was central part of Cold War, and then playground or a place where all the post-Cold War liberal peace building was fully applied. I think we very voluntarily accepted the liberal democratization process in the 90s. We accepted the liberal constitutions. Yeah, we wanted to integrate with Europe. So we did accept also peace building strategies that came in. I think there is an interesting now period where that didn't work out again for whatever reasons. And now there's a sudden reaction to acceptance or critique of the liberal peace building paradigm. And now you see emergence of new approaches, which are pretty actually robust following the Second Karabakh War. Before that, you wouldn't see the whole domination. The space was dominated very much by, right? Europe going to come and teach us, and we're going to implement approaches. All the NGO sector was based on that, also funded that way. As all of this, most of these folks went to supporting war or disappeared essentially from the field during Second Karabakh War, and really the bankruptcy of that approach was exposed. In a way, vacuum opened up that has been filled with a lot of critical voices. And now in the South Caucasus, at least in Armenia, Azerbaijan, maybe less so in Georgia, that is still in a way on Europeanization path in that sense. In Armenia and Azerbaijan, I'm seeing a lot of emergence of critical voices and really rethinking, taking ownership of what peace means, how we want to continue, where do we want to go, and really starting to apply new approaches. That's very new. It started again, in my view, only post Second Karabakh War. How does it manifest itself? Yeah, so I don't think one paradigm is possible at this stage. I critique the liberal and realist a bit, but there is also a problem I see with what normally is framed as post-liberal or third generation. I think it's gone too small. It's done some good work talking about everyday peace in some localities where some local groups are able to coexist despite everything that's happening, which is fantastic, all great. But that does not explain what you do when you are bombed by from outside, or when some kind of a major breakdown of a society happens. These don't necessarily give us any answers, in my view, about how to handle conflicts. So I'm personally looking into this more hybrid approach. I think there is necessity to re-engage with realism, for example, because we have international warfare, and that helps us understand it better or analyze the actions of different state actors. I think wherever it's possible, or whatever tools from liberal peace building we know can still be applied. Again, Northern Ireland is democracy, great. Let's apply whatever we can apply, whatever we can learn. There are a lot of specific tools that are useful from that, but necessarily focus on also developing third and fourth. And I fully agree with Sevinj on the feminist studies have really great advances and really move the conversation in third, fourth generation, especially of feminism, or how we can rethink the whole concept of gender. So essentially, there's a transformation happening there of the concept itself that is making qualitative difference in terms of violence that has been gendered. So we are very far from getting into any good place, but you can see the development of the thought and approaches. So similarly, really trying to be less dogmatic, and I say more hybrid. So let's apply whatever we know. If it's realism and conflict management, because we need to make a ceasefire agreement, great, right? So let's do that. Let's not reject that because we are conceptually opposed. But there is a necessity of developing these third and fourth paradigms, again, somewhat similar to feminism. And I think that's happening very much in South Caucasus. Taking place in real time is going to take time to catch up. I'll have some details, but I'll leave it for later. Do you want to, let me see if there is some questions, and then. But if you want to come in with your take on where are we now, and to Margareta's question, is there anything South Caucasus has to offer to itself, first of all, and then to peace studies in general?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that maybe there is a need now for this hybrid approach, because we are so much lost, actually, that we don't really necessarily know how to get out of this repetitive dynamics. And we have different regime types, which we always said that democratization would change, but we have now different regime types that we are dealing with in terms of conflict, and different powers in the geopolitics of the region. So I would say, yes, the hybrid might help us to understand, but I don't necessarily see it as a future of how it can be transformed further. Yeah, realism can probably right now at this moment help us so that we wouldn't have fights on the border. But what is next? I think that is one of the questions, and probably now some of the people who are involved in the peace process in the civil society level are questioning that. But also one thing I have also observed after 2020, it's that all these professionalized peace builders, let's say people who studied peace and conflict studies, they are not necessarily very much engaged in, I mean, you and probably and a few other people are very much exception who still continues. We have people from different disciplines now engaged, and I think this is very interesting dynamics. And this is what you already mentioned before, that we didn't have peace movement. Now I think it's a more political movement that is cross-discipline, basically. We have feminist groups, queer groups, we have people who study history, people who are in different disciplines, basically, yeah.
Thanks.
But maybe we go to the next question.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions, and I'm trying to see if we can combine them. So one is, let me come from the end. It's questions that the failure of liberal peace building is very much connected to essentially ignoring the very local needs, right? So it was bringing top-down blueprint that didn't necessarily work or was accepted. Question is, are we going too far in opposite direction and bringing too quick the local voice concept, and will it end up ignoring the top-down dynamics? Then somewhat related question by Nonna Shahrazad is that it failed. We acknowledged 30 years. So, where do we go from here in a way, and who are the key actors even we can trust to lead this conversation if we are to move past violence? You want to start? I'll have a couple of thoughts on this as well.
I can start. Perhaps from the first question about the local voices, inclusion, and so on. Well, I think it's generally about the understanding of peace as a political force rather than just peace as an agreement between the states. I think this is one of the critics of it, because even if we are talking about the agreement between the states, in this case Azerbaijan and Armenian states, there is a lot of nuances that is not necessarily aligning with the voices of people anyways. So we have actually, that's why I say we are lost, because previously, let's say we had OSCE format or some other forms of formats top down completely, but now we are saying what is now bottom up format, and we don't necessarily have any structurized bottom up format anyways. I think it's now emerging to some extent, but it's not as massive, or it's not as political that it would shape certain politics or create some sort of massive consciousness among people and bring their needs, let's say, to the. So we are in this in between situation right now, and one of the reasons for us still not having this bottom up approach is the failure of liberal peace. So for me, the failure of liberal peace is not only that we didn't achieve peace between these conflicting states through democratization or through marketization, but also because we didn't have any space for movement building. So peace become kind of detached from actual public understanding. And there are several reasons why it happened and how it happened over the course of this 20 and more years. But it's also probably precisely because of institutionalization of peace building per se, and how the deinstitutionalization will happen is also another question, when in reality it's still hard to talk about peace. It's still the whole information and history and all the narrative building process is not in the hands of people who would actually like to shape it. So it's mostly very much still top dominant, but top dominant in terms of the political allies in the countries. And that's why even when we see this bilateral Azerbaijani-Armenian negotiations, direct negotiations, even that doesn't say us a lot, because we know how it will turn. We know that direct negotiations does not necessarily reflect the people's needs anyway. So I think, I agree that we have to acknowledge the power dynamics, but also it's nice that basically it hasn't politicized. We are in between of all these processes. And these 30 years old peacemaking efforts, why they failed, I think this is one of the big questions. I was researching about the relationship between state and civil society who was engaged in peace building. So we have, let's say, we call them first generation of peace builders from the 90s, whom I was interviewing, and you can see some of them have this frustration over the years, how in the 90s, as Phil saying, they believed in the liberal peace idea. So they were not only working for peace building, but they were also quite actively were engaged in the democratization of their societies. So their frustration comes hand in hand with not only the peace that failed, but also the democratization that process failed in Azerbaijan. In Armenia, the context was different because the revolution happened. But in general, I would say they had these frustrations and there was no continuity of this let's say, knowledge production or even practices that existed. Some of these practices are lying down in history and not much people know about it. But also, yeah, I think there is also general political context to how the war emerged in 2020. But this is a completely different conversation. Maybe that makes it, that kind of shifts your question. I don't want to shift your question. Maybe Phil, you can comment on it.
Thanks. I'll also bring in one more question, which was about nationalism and how does peace studies deal with the topic of nationalism. So I'll try to take on the question of that local voice and nationalism together. So one thing that really happened again in this long period of 90s until now was the top-down approach you mentioned, which again sounds really beautiful, right? So it's peace through democratization, with like two in one, right? So you get democracy and everybody has a voice, you have great institutions and constitutions, and you have peace. So why not? In principle, on paper, the question is again, why it didn't work, right? So one of the main complicated maybe answers, but is it possible to have the whole world democratic? Is it possible to have even in terms of resources, right? Because if you think what are the liberal democracies that tend to be primarily the former colonial states, essentially, that do consume overwhelming amount of resources, does make sense, that does make possible for their local population to live in relative prosperity. Can we bring China to the level of France or US and have enough resources to sustain? If not, can we have democracy in China? These kind of questions come up in a big picture. But what happened once essentially none of the post-colonial states necessarily, very few democratized, unless very few like the Baltics that were accepted to European Union, and there were very small states. Very few regions that's post-colonial have democratized, and so in that sense we have this big disconnect between democratization aspiration and the economic prosperity that should come with marketization and the reality on the ground, which actually mostly ends up in impoverishing the spaces more. And then against this background, when you have a collapse, essentially state collapse, right, moving from one system to another, a lot of poverty, and you have a very top-down approach where this is how you should do. You should become Europe without really a prospect of becoming a Europe in terms of what you are striving to be, right? Especially which is the heavily economic part of that. Then there is this big disconnect where you have a rejection by the local populations where their practices are ignored, right? So you need to accept some kind of a blueprint from somewhere else, which doesn't work with local customs. Well, you also don't see the tangible benefits of you are not becoming kind of prosperous that say, okay, at least this is what I'm getting in return. So that's where the top-down started faltering, in my view. Yes, the time went by, and they started seeing that neither Russia nor most of the former Soviet space is democratizing or becoming prosperous. Then the backlash was against liberal democracy, including liberal peace building. To the question of going in opposite direction too far, I actually agree. I think we are going too far in opposite direction, too far prioritizing local. Again, we should accept that there is not pure local left. All the local is in some form influenced by centuries, really, of different colonial practices. So like education has been standardized. A lot of the structures are standardized. So a lot of the practices are not local in any sense, any serious sense anymore. But still, I think I am in favor overall of very much mixed hybrid approach, including on top down to bottom up. I think you do need to work with structures and governments, and you need to work with locals. The question is whose voice gets primacy in designing peace building initiatives, and there I think unequivocally it should be local. And I'll just bring an example again of feminism here. At this point, at least in those of us who are trying to do something about, say, gender-based violence, it would be quite absurd to have a group of men, right, lead a conversation about women empowerment or some kind of feminist policies. It will be very, very strange to see, right? So I don't know, only men participating in design of feminist policies. That hopefully is obvious. And yet, if you think what's happening in peace building, right? So we completely cut out the local. All the decision making is happening in Brussels and DC and London, where by people essentially who are not impacted whatsoever. So for me, the equivalent of men in a way making up feminist policies. So this is where I think the shift is obvious. If you are not impacted, right, you can be an ally. By all means, you need to support peace building from DC and Brussels and London, right? So as if men should support all kind of moves towards kind of gender equality and abolishing gender-based violence, but they should be in a supporting role, right? So they should follow, not lead. So in this sense, I see necessary shift. I think everybody should work together, but whose opinion matters in designing. It should have a shift, which we are slowly only seeing, I believe. It has been still thought that Washington knows better, right? So like the NGO in London actually knows better what's needed in Baku, Yerevan, or Stepanakert, they're going to tell you not the other way around. So that shift is necessary. Now that brings me to the point of nationalism, actually, very briefly, interestingly. So this is where I would question that everything is working, disagree with Sevinj, with you, that everything is working top-down. For example, nationalism, it's so ingrained that it's very much working top-down, of course, but also bottom-up. Example, in Armenia, there has been numerous attempts by first government of Ter-Petrosyan and then latest government to, for example, enact history education reform. And you have a very bottom-up revolt or resistance, let's say, to any change. Bottom-up or middle-up? Middle-up is probably a better word because we have teachers and academics who are not letting essentially any change to come in and challenge ethno-nationalism as a dominant paradigm. Yeah. So you do have, it says not power is not distributed all top down. Unfortunately, nationalism is what drives the conversation. So to conclude here for me to the questions of what do we do is that there is a conflict management end of conversation, which is you manage violence as we go. We try to stop it, right? So minimize violence. That's necessary and daily work we should continue doing, unfortunately. Then there is the conflict transformation end of the conversation, which is we need to transform. Specifically, we need to move past or challenge nationalism as the only dominant really ideology on which we base our daily interactions in. And one shift you are seeing, and it's very top-down so far, is that there is a conversation of the fourth republics, as in post-Karabakh war, in a way, identities of Armenia and Azerbaijan. There's talk of changing constitutions and so on, right? So that's a type of a thing where you try to change national identity, which doesn't need to be rooted necessarily in enmity with the other, but it might. So there is this big question of how these constitutions will develop, how the civil society and bottom-up approaches will react. Is it possible to design, either bottom-up or top-down or in a mix identities that are not rooted in kind of forever enmity of Armenians and Azerbaijanis with each other? It's possible since the context is changing, but that's an interesting process to see. But that's the transformation end. And one piece here, the identities don't need to only be national. Politically meaningful identities can also be very much intersectional, let's say. And there, I think I'm coming closer to your point that, for example, we can learn a lot from feminist IR, from like many other movements that are not seeing ethnic identity as the only politically meaningful identity. And I think it is necessary as we are moving overall towards a space where states are not the only actors who hold power. Thank you.
Yeah,
I
I have a bit different take, for instance, on the way you said how nationalism functions, because even at least you mentioned like mid power distribution. I also agree that power doesn't distribute from only top down. I agree that it's distributed maybe unevenly, and this is where the relationship of state and society is formulated. But also that's where the civil society also positions itself, because I think one of the frustration and the reality that we saw was the nationalism that civil society was actually carrying, and it has been like this since the end of the Soviet Union. So how the national liberation movement started. So what is the history of national liberation movement? Who was it liberation movement involved? How it reached this massivity and so on. And there is always this, there will be an ideological vacuum, and most of the states use this historically when there is an ideological vacuum to actually address the social injustices. Nationalism always comes in hand. And that's why we also saw it after the revolution in Armenia as well, the rise of nationalism as one of the trends, instead of imagining democratization bringing contra-nationalism. So I think the question about nationalism is probably primarily a fundamental question that peace and conflict studies should address, but also we see it less of a discussion or critical discussion when we mention nationalism or the root of nationalism. But yeah, I mean, for Azerbaijan, the nationalism, we see, for instance, a new form of nationalism emerging after the victory in Karabakh, and that's a trend that is globally prevalent. We see how this new format of nationalism involves far-right ideologies, traditionalism, anti-gender politics, anti-feminist politics, and so on. So you never have one just pure nationalist ideology. It has lots of other elements to it, which is very much prevalent. So I don't think nationalism necessarily comes from bottom up. Yeah, but we can argue this further. And there was another question, I think. So it was saying that a few people with peace study background being involved in the region, and your involvement in peace studies and actual studying this rather than being an NGO. I think this is one of the very good questions, because so far the people who were engaged in the NGO level of peace building were quite detached from the critical theories that existed. Actually, we're doing a lot of practices without being aware of this underlying theories, and that's why there was less of a criticism. So all the projects which were designed in Brussels, in New York, in London, and so on, they were taken by default without any criticism from the local people who were engaged in this process, because they, first of all, one, believed in that, and secondly, they didn't have any form of critical view on the existing paradigm or tactics that were provided for them. So I think some people who were engaged in the peace and conflict studies definitely brought this format of linking theory and practice, but some didn't. And I think the people who didn't is precisely the consequence of IR scholarship itself, because in IR we have still predominantly realist and liberal views of conflict transformation of conflict resolution. So that's why we still see a lot of these peace experts, or let's say conflict experts or IR experts, who are basically sharing that similar views. So they are not necessarily very critical, but some people are, and that people are definitely linking the theories and the practices.
Thank you. I think the one big thing, we promised to finish in 1 hour, so let's give it another 1 or 2 minutes to wrap up, if possible. I think one emergent theme that clearly has been articulated and we didn't address enough, I would believe, is nationalism. So we probably should make a conversation specifically on that topic. So thank you for this, and we will take it into consideration, because yes, there is lots that, of course, peace studies say about nationalism, but it's a very complicated conversation, and we have very different takes of even what nationalism means, right? So it was very hard to answer in 1 or 2 minutes. Probably deserves a whole hour of discussion, so I will take that on. Thank you for this, and please join us then. So I want to remind again that next Thursday, a week from now, again at 7 p.m., we will have the second webinar. The speakers are Kristina Soloyan and Paula Darchinova, and the topic is what is violence? How can we understand it and address it, hopefully? And there is a link we just posted in the chat screen if you want to sign up while you're here. Please go for it. If not, we will, of course, post it on Facebook as we usually do. So thank you one more time for engaging. Thank you, Sevinj, for a great conversation and your input. Of course, we probably, opened up some questions that rather than close them, but it was the first conversation that we hope to continue. So yeah, please leave us any feedback in any form you can, and we would appreciate it to see how we can improve this format. And again, try to become a bit more conceptual and not only political, while we will continue our political analysis as well. So thank you one more time. Thank you, Sevinj. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
And looking forward
Thank
to
you,
seeing you.
everyone. Thank you, Phil. I think we missed some questions in the chat,
Yeah.
but hopefully next time. So yeah.
They're both about
Thank you.
nationalism, so I'm hoping to address them. So thank you all.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.